The worry of China's economic slowdown hitting markets around the world, Maria sat down with Morgan Stanley China CEO Christianson to get her take on the Chinese markets today.
I think it's important for people to remember that China, in absolute terms, is a 10.4 trillion economy. So even though people are focused on the precise growth, whether it's a 5%, 6% or 7%, in absolute number, for instance, in case of a 5% growth, that's really a low-end scenario. We're still talking about 500 billion of economic growth, which is roughly about 40% of the world growth.
Yeah. Let me ask you about the government's steps recently to stop and halt the sell-off that we've seen. I mean, I think that's what worries market participants as well. You see the Chinese stock market go down sharply, and all of a sudden the government steps in and says, okay, we're halting things, and we're telling short sellers they can't do that anymore. How do you deal with that, running Morgan Stanley China? I mean, this has to be hard to take.
Well, these measures that the Chinese government have introduced is called the circuit breaker. Essentially, it's used the CSI 300 as a benchmark. So if it goes down by 5%, it will cause for 15 minutes to stop, and that if 7%, then it's a whole day suspension. This was not a Chinese invention. This was actually invented in the United States in 1987.
I remember the New York Stock Exchange used to do things like this, by the way.
So that was about 30 years ago. I think it's important to recognize that when government or any government put together a regulatory framework, there is no fit-at-all kind of a model, right? It works in the U.S. and it works in certain markets, but it may not necessarily fit other markets or other jurisdictions.
Why are we seeing such a reaction on the part of investors? Why does the market keep selling off, in your view?
I think there was, last year, the market was rough, and a government intervened. And again, it is all these unknown factors, and the investors were not clear about what's lying ahead. And also, I think it reflects the structural issues of the market. This market lacks diversity in terms of the investor basis, because 80% of the trading of the Chinese market is retail, versus the United States is 2/3 of the trading is the institution. I think the homogeneous base of the investor base actually is not very healthy, because it lacks the differences in valuation, and it deters other investors to participate.
That's what I was going to ask you about the Chinese investor today. Are you seeing a change in terms of the mentality that increasingly want to put money into the public markets, or is this major sell-off now sort of shutting that down?
I think there is still a lot of element of speculation in the market, and so hence it is really important for the government to really diversify the investor base and also the products and the instruments, right? It needs to be diversified. The other issues, that as we talk about here a lot, is the quality of the information disclosure, right? Because I think the Chinese regulator is going to introduce this registration-based system, which hopefully will enhance the disclosure standards, because investors need to have access to truthful and fully disclosed information in order to assess the valuation to reflect the fundamentals of the company.
As we wrap up here, Wei, earlier in the interview, as we were talking about the economy, you put it into context in terms of the size of the Chinese economy. How would you characterize the growth story today? Is it weaker than many people think?
I think actually the growth is, slowed down. There's no doubt about it. But the good news is that you have a better mix. In other words, the Chinese government has been focusing on rebalancing, meaning, simultaneously they're trying to change the growth driver from the investment-driven into the consumption and the service-driven, which is good. And at the same time, they got to address the structural issues and the problems existing in the system. And also, they are taking care of the supply side of the reform, which means the taking care of the overcapacity, and which has been built up in the past few years because the stimulus policies that have been introduced for many years.
Special thanks to Wei Christianson there.